Okay.
And this is the reason we, Mahatma Gandhi Central University Teachers Association, is Champaran, Bihar, takes the place to resist this draconian policy, this repressive policy that is NEP. And in that context, we have today Professor Felix Padel. Let me give you a brief introduction of Felix Padel. Felix Padel is, as I told you, an eminent uh, is an eminent anthropologist. He is very famous human rights activist. More than that, he is the person who has worked a lot tirelessly 30 years in India for the betterment of the most marginalized section, that is Adivasi. Uh, as an academic, he has been very, very bright. He did his master's from Oxford, then shifted to Delhi School of Economics for his MPhil, then enrolled himself in Oxford again with a kind of affiliation to Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi. Uh, he has authored many books, to name a few: Sacrificing People, Invasions of a Tribal Landscape, that was published by Oxford University Press. Then uh, Out of This Earth, East India Adivasis and Aluminium Cartel, that is published by Orient. Then we have his third book, that is Ecology, Economy, Quest for a Socially Informed Connection. He is widely published person. He has written so many articles in reputed journals like EPW and other internationally recognized journals. More than academic, he is the person. He believed in a kind of praxis. He believed in humanity, the betterment of humanity, and this is the reason he worked as a volunteer for survival international, especially on big dam issues, including the Sardar Sarovar. A strong advocate of tribal and village community rights. He believes that the industrial assault on natural ecosystems is destined to have cascading and devastating effects on the future of humanity unless severely checked, and that we can see in 50%, almost 50% displaced population consists of the Adivasis. They are displaced, they are destituted, their lives are destituted, a kind of apathy towards Adivasis we can see of the ruling class. These Adivasis, when they resist, because when your existence is at the stake, you need to resist, and they resist because they believe in life, they believe that nature, with whom they are very, very close, need to be protected, and this is the reason they resist the state violence, the violence or the corporate loot under the guidance of the state, and if resisted, the violence. So in that context, today's talk is very, very important. I will not take much time, but I will just request Felix Padel to start this talk with one of his most favorite song, because he's known as a very good violinist also. Over to you, Felix Padel. So,
okay, thank you very much for that introduction, Mrityunjay. So I'll try and talk for about 30, 40 minutes, and then I hope people will ask questions. And since you've asked me to start with a song, I'll start with a famous song about the Bob Dylan song, How Many Roads Must a Man Walk Down? I don't know if some of you will probably know it, but it's a song that has been a symbol of freedom and you could say an anti-war song. man walk down before you can call him a man. Listen, how many seas does a white dove sail before she meets in the sand? How many times does the cannonball fly before they land in the band? The answer, my friends, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. How many years can a mountain exist before it's washed to the sea? How many years can some people exist before they're allowed to be free? How many times can a man turn his head and pretend that he just cannot see? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. How many times does a man look up before he can see the sky? Listen, how many years must one man have before he can hear people cry? How many years will it take till he knows that too many people have died? The answer, my friends, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. Okay, thank you. Well, with that little introduction, thank you very much, Mrityunjay, for your words introducing me and the topic. I really appreciate them. I'm very aware of how difficult situation education is in every part of the world at the moment, and how much it's been corporatized or privatized. I myself, as you said, I did my first degrees in Oxford, but then I did my MPhil in sociology in the Delhi School of Economics under well-known Indian sociologists such as Andrea Bhate, A.M. Shah, Veena Das, J.P.S. Oberoi. These were my four main teachers. And so because of that, and then I did my doctorate in social anthropology from Oxford, but I was still affiliated and my real teachers were still those ones in Delhi School. So I feel in that sense, equally a sociologist and an anthropologist. And the difference is quite interesting because a lot of India's best known sociologists, they trained in anthropology before. So for example, Gurrier, he did his anthropology degree in Cambridge and then he became an Indian sociologist. M.N. Srinivas did his anthropology degree in Oxford, then he became a sociologist. My teachers, Veena Das, J.P.S. Oberoi, similarly, they were anthropologists primarily, and then they became sociologists. So that is something to reflect on that I will come back to, because maybe in India, there is a sense in which anthropology still has quite a colonial context, in the sense that many Indian anthropologists are employed by the Anthropological Survey of India. So because they're government servants, they don't tend to study the power structure or the government. So as I say, I'll come back to that. And then you mentioned the new education policy, and I must admit I haven't looked at that in much detail, but again, in your questions, you can really emphasize on this and ask questions about this. So, as you said, I use the term Adivasis rather than tribals because maybe more and more people are questioning the idea of tribe. So at independence, the people who the British had called the forest tribes or the jungle tribes or the primitive tribes, they were classified as the scheduled tribes. And so you can say, to some extent, in the main part of India, those who are classified as scheduled tribes are Adivasis. But all of you, I'm sure, will know that the categories are very, very problematic in many ways. Many people who should have ST status don't have it. And the word Adivasi was popularized by Jaipal Singh Munda, who was from Bihar, of course, now from the part that is Jharkhand, but he saw himself as a Bihari and a product of Bihar. And he was the first, probably Adivasi, to do a higher degree, and he did his first degree in Oxford University. And then he came back, he played hockey, and he became a hockey champion in India. But then in the 1930s, he became a political leader, and he popularized the Jharkhand movement and the term Adivasi. So a little bit like for Dalits, they used to be called untouchables, Harijans, and then Dalit is a political identity that they formulated. So it is similar for Adivasi. And it's very interesting if you look at the Constituent Assembly debates in 1946 to 1949 that happened before and after independence, that gave rise to the 5th and 6th schedules. There were very impassioned debates in that between several people, but especially between Jaipal Singh and some of the other people, and in particular, Thakur Bappa. So, Thakur Bappa, if some of you know, was the person who spread and started tribal education, and in a sense was delegated to do that by Gandhi. But in this Constituent Assembly debates, there was a very strong debate about whether the term Adivasi should be used at independence or it should be something else. So in fact, when the term scheduled tribe was formulated, Jaipal Singh was excluded from that discussion. So with Adivasis meaning first dwellers, obviously it has a particular political or ideological connotation that they are kind of India's first dwellers. So obviously many people wanted to contest that. And also many people, like there was people saying, well, the tribal people in Maharashtra, in Nagaland, in everywhere, they are very, very different. So how can you use one term? And of course, Adivasis is not used by people in the Northeast, except for members of the so-called tea tribes who were taken there by the British. So in using the term Adivasis, I mean, I also don't want to exclude the Northeastern tribal people. So this is a kind of a problem of language and categories that those of us who deal in these issues are constantly up against. And nowadays we have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So India signed that, but then said, well, India has no specific indigenous peoples. So it's in international law, it's quite hard to apply that act to India. And so, in fact, the people who came from India in the defining of that UN declaration were basically from Jharkhand and from the Northeast, basically from Nagas and so on. So they, right back then from the 60s, 70s to now, they are claiming that indigenous status. And of course, this is something incredibly controversial in India because unlike, say, the whole continent of America, where you had Europeans invading indigenous peoples and committing genocide, in India, you always had the people, the tribal people or the forest people living alongside the mainstream populations. But arguably, now what is happening with the mass takeover of the tribal land, you are beginning to have a similar situation to that mass takeover of the indigenous land that happened all over North and South and Central America. So what defines Adivasis? Again, it's very hard to point to anything that applies in every case, but one of the features is this connection with the land, that the culture is very much linked to an identification with the land. And very often the religion is or was very much linked to that land. And in particular, even though a lot of Adivasis have worshipped Shiva or Rama or other Hindu deities, even from maybe before the Hindus did, that certainly for many, many centuries, like even the Birho, who are a hunter-gatherer group in Jharkhand and other states, they have their own version of the Ramayana, different from the Sanskrit or other regional versions. So it's not that they are necessarily distinct from what is called Hinduism, but above all, they didn't use Brahmin priests. So they had their own priests, and very often also shamans who would go into trance, speak to the ancestors. They would follow dreams. They would not follow texts, Sanskrit texts. So in many ways, what is happening in India is a history that has been prefigured by what's happening in other countries such as Indonesia and Philippines, as well as this genocidal situation that happened in New Zealand, Australia, North America, and so on. Okay, that's very briefly, and again, do ask questions about this. Who are the Adivasis and why are they important? In terms of education, there are many different ideologies of education or pedagogies. And if you like, what the British started in India, when you have Macaulay's Minute in Education, he wanted he wanted an Indian elite who were fluent in English, which is what happened. And in a way, a similar thing was done by the missionaries who started the education in tribal areas, that they were not trying, because it's interesting, in the same period, from the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, you have mission schools in India and you have mission schools in the United States and in Canada. But in the United States, Canada, Australia, you had all the children taken by force and they were to be assimilated by force. They were not allowed to practice their religion or speak the language at school. On entry to the school, they would always have their hair cut short and they would always be assigned a Christian name rather than their traditional name. So you had that in those countries outside India. In India, the role of missionaries was different. It was more like Macaulay. They were trying to create a tribal elite, an educated tribal elite, many of them who became Christians. So that's why in the Northeast and in Jharkhand and other places, you have Christians. So if you're understanding this beginning of tribal education that happened in India, obviously with the many other educational schools that the British started in India, maybe the elite were allowed to think for themselves, but for the ordinary people, it was very much learning by rote, the 3 R's, as it's called, and you learn what's in the textbook, you don't really question it. And still, I'm sure a lot of you know, that is very, very common in schools in India and around the world, that children, they have to pass exams, it's very competitive, and you pass the exams basically by saying what the teacher or the textbooks they want you to say. So another completely different philosophy of education is the idea that to become educated is to learn how to think critically, to question your teachers and yourself, your community. So if you look at some of the radical pedagogies that have been there, one of the most inspiring in the Indian case, that has only been applied in a few schools, is that of the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, who wrote this book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where children were encouraged in their school situation to speak about their circumstance, to talk about what's happening in their family life, in the political society. So the only school that I know that is really doing this, well, actually there are 2, they're both in Madhya Pradesh. One is in Bhopal, and it's called Muskan, and one is a bit south of that near Bhavani, and it's called Adashala School. And they very much draw on this political consciousness raising of the Paulo Freire method. And what those schools also do is they use the tribal languages. So I'll come to this later, but obviously many Adivasis now, they become masters of Hindi, and they write in Hindi, they write poetry in Hindi, and it has become very useful for them in that sense. But the tribal languages have very much been marginalized. So many people think, well, surely if they want to get educated, they have to learn Hindi, English, and they have to become fluent in the mainstream languages. But actually, if you go into the understanding of what is multilingual education, very often you find the children, when they really are encouraged to learn in their tribal language originally, then they become fluent in other languages too, and learning Hindi, English is no problem. But the trouble in India, what has happened, because obviously there are so many languages, there are so many state languages, and then there are so many tribal languages. So if you have the 3 education policy of the Kothari Commission from the 1960s, you have Hindi as a national language, or then you have the state language, if that's different, and then you have English. And the regional languages, or the tribal languages in particular, they don't form part of this 3-language policy. So this became a bone of contention, going back to the Constituent Assembly debates in 1946 to 9. Jaipal Singh Munda and Thakur Bappa had a real clash over this, because Thakur Bappa had written a paper in 1941 that is quite widely read, that gives his philosophy. And basically, like the sociologist Gurye, he sees tribal people as basically backward Hindus who have to be brought forward. And just like the British, he sees the shifting cultivation as a very ignorant, kind of labor wasting and destructive kind of cultivation, while other people would say that actually shifting cultivation destroys the forest much less than settled cultivation. When you have permanent fields, that means the real destruction of the forest. And so Thakur Bappa was very open in calling tribal people lazy and ignorant, superstitious, using a lot of these stereotypes. But he did write that in the first 2 years in school, it's good to use the tribal language, because that forms a bridge between tribal people who have their own communities where they're using that language and then the mainstream. So Jaipal Singh really confronted Thakur Bappa over this. And in that assembly, he said, Thakur Bappa, how many tribal languages do you know? And Thakur admitted, I don't know any. And Jaipal said, well, I'm glad you admit it. And actually most of your teachers in your schools, in the ashram schools, they also don't know tribal languages. So this is really alienating. The schools are something very alien from us because of this. And if you look at India's first commissions and reports on the tribal situation in independent India, they're what is known as the Elwyn Committee Report and the Deba Committee Report in 1960. They were both from 1959 to 1961. And they were very strong on the subject of education, saying education is very important, but it should be in schools that are built in the tribal style. They should use the tribal languages. And Deba in particular had a real argument with a lot of the state governments who were very reluctant to use the tribal languages. For example, Orissa, probably Bihar too. So the central government was kind of leaning on them to try to prepare tribal textbooks in the tribal languages. And in fact, that has been done again and again. And it is a constituent right of every child in India to be taught in their mother tongue. And yet the fact is that in most ashram schools and most of the other tribal schools, they have not been allowed even to speak their language. And very often you have the situation where if a child speaks the language at school, it's punished. I mean, that the school should actually be making the curriculum in that language, but the language is not even allowed. And what the Commission also made the very important recommendation, I'm talking about from 1960 onwards, this is, that school timings should be adjusted for when the tribal people are working in the fields and when the time of religious festivals is happening. So tribal religious festivals are very much attuned to nature. And again, this policy recommendation was almost never implemented. So it's really quite shocking. Reports since then, you see people saying the tribal people are very ignorant. They don't want their children to come to school. They're wanting them to work in the field and do child labor. This actually is a very ignorant way of looking at it, because how did tribal children learn? Did they have no education before there were schools? So Elwyn showed in relation to in Buster in particular, that Muria Gons, that they have the Gotul, they have a very, very subtle and complex system of education, where one of the things about tribal culture is a tribal parent in the traditional culture will never tell a child what to do. Go and get that, go and do that, stand up, sit down. They just don't, that's not part of the culture to do that. So in the Gotul, and you had the Dumkuria among the Oraon, and many of the other tribes have had a similar thing. You have older children who are teaching the younger ones. So older boys are teaching the younger boys. Older girls are teaching the younger girls. And at the same time, the children are going with their parents and they work in the fields. Like if you have a baby and you see the baby growing up, you see the child is wanting very much to do the same thing as the parent. So then you have the child in the house beginning to want to do the same things as its mother. You have the child in the fields beginning to want to do the same thing as its father or its uncle or its brother. And then that is actually how knowledge is passed on. So what we take for granted as this is work, this is education, it's completely different in tribal culture. So the education happened with work. So children themselves would want to work. And in this sense, children working in the field with their parents is normal and even a totally healthy phenomenon. Of course, child labor is when you have exploitation of children employed in a brick kiln or in even as servants or anything else by other people. But in their own communities, to see it as child labor in the same way is just not correct. So you had all of these quite enlightened understandings quite early on in independence, and then they were not followed through. So this talk is about Adivasi's education and the environment. And thank you, Murthanjay, for saying a bit about the environmental context. So if you start again in British times, the way it started in India is the Forest Rights Act that alienated it, created a divide and rule between the Adivasis and the forest. So originally, it's not that Adivasis saw the forest as belonging to them. They had totally recognized rights to do what they wanted with it, but the whole culture was oriented to conserving it, to working a bit of it for food and timber, and but then always regenerating it and always working with the forest spirits. Because in a way, if you see the word culture, we have three words in English from that. We have culture, we have cultivation, and we have cult. So cult means religion. And if you look at an Adivasi society, the three of these are completely together, that the culture is all bound up with the system of cultivation and how you, what I call Adivasi economics, how you make the living out of nature. And then the religion is completely based on, and that is what a child is learning. So a child an Adivasi child in its original village, it's learning about the forest, how to recognize hundreds of different plants, the healing properties, the food properties of those plants, how to hunt, but also the ancestors, the myths of the particular community, and the dances. So dancing is a very big part of Adivasi culture, obviously. And in a way, you can see the kind of symbiosis that has existed. I mean, some people would say that you're romanticizing the tribes, but I think it's not to say that there's just as much good and bad in the culture, that people made war, they have witchcraft, they do revenge, there's many negative features, but in this sense of, another thing that happened in the Constituent Assembly debate was Nehru was talking in this debate, look, we have to bring democracy to the tribal areas. And by the way, still that is something quite questionable whether it's happened. But Jaipal Singh confronted him and he said, Nehruji, how can you bring democracy to tribal areas? Adivasis are the most democratic people on earth. You have to learn democratic ways from them. And so this democracy that is part of the tribal culture, you see it in one level in the economic system that you see in Adivasi economics, where you're exchanging labor. There's no unfair exchange happening. All exchange is based on a fair exchange, and one family is exchanging its labor for another. And you're also exercising restraint in what is taken from nature. And then in education itself, there's none of this competition, winners, losers. In law also, the idea of law, many people have commented on this in anthropologically in tribal society, that the legal process the aim of the legal process is to reconcile the contestants. I mean, how civilized is that? When you have what is called the Roman system of law, which is basically the system of law everywhere, where you have lawyers who are highly paid, and then a judge that judges one party right and the other wrong. And very often the outcome anyway depends on paying the lawyers. But this idea of right and wrong, it's not so much there in Adivasi society. They might, when you see a debate or any Gram Sabha or a real meeting, you see this democracy in process in a very egalitarian way. So very often in the legal process, one party might be judged wrong and fined, but everybody has their say. And having that say is really what the legal process in Adivasi society is about. And similarly with sport and education, like very often you see the corporates now, Tata Steel and the other companies, they're patronizing tribal sport very, very, very much. Why? Obviously they see, well, Adivasis are very athletic, but it's more than that, because in sport, you cultivate competitiveness. In every game, there is usually winners and losers. And if you look at the dance, in a way, traditional Adivasi dance is democracy in action. You have the enemy village coming in, dancing, and but then if you see how, for example, Kish, the talk that I showed on the poster, the Collegiate Institute of Social Science, how television or in a big conclave that Tata Steel would call, where I've seen it also, where you invite the Adivasi, you wear we started with looking at the missionary schools who started most of the education in India. And then from the 1920s, you had these ashram schools. And these ashram schools were meant to be based on Gandhi's model of education, which is very using local knowledge, local languages. But in fact, as I'm saying, the ashram schools generally excluded that. And because these schools tend to be residential, from the 1960s also, the Kothari Commission was hugely expanding and asking for this huge expansion of residential schools and hostels. And the Kothari Commission actually spells it out to try to suit the tribal people for the industrialization that is taking place in the tribal areas. So under Nehru, you all will know that Nehru called dams the temples of modern India. And he started the first aluminium industry, Hindalco, under his time. And actually Elwin, who was in charge of the tribal affairs under him and was a close friend of Nehru, he never challenged Nehru on this, just as he never challenged Nehru when Nehru sent the troops into Nagaland. So Nehru was presiding over a massive industrialization in the beginning of that in certain pockets. That, again, Elwin never really talked about the issue of displacement that was starting in such a big way then. So obviously you'll all know what's happened since of the massive industrialization that is happening with the mining projects, as well as the big dams and the corporate plantations of forestry and so on. So I suppose this model of residential schools has got more and more and more extreme. And it's very interesting if you look at the world history context of that, because in the United States and in Canada and in Australia and in New Zealand, by the 1970s, it was understood that massive sexual abuse and other abuse was happening in these residential schools, in all of them, and that they had to be closed. So by the 1980s, they were all closed, and the Prime Minister of Canada and Australia and even the United States have given apologies to the whole people for the policy of assimilation that was based on residential schooling. But at the same time that these were being closed in the 1970s to 80s, India was expanding its residential schools for tribal people massively. And that's what the Virginius Kaka in his 2014 committee report, he calls this an unacknowledged policy of assimilation. And basically it's based on what the residential schools are doing. That just like with the schools in Canada and everything, that the children had to take on a Christian name when they enter, tens of thousands of Adivasis have had to take on a Hindu name when they enter the ashram school or the other local school. And then that goes on their birth certificate, and they use that name for life often. Like before happened with Christian names also in India. Also the hair cutting short and all that. So the Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences, just to maybe come to the kind of climax of the talk on that, I asked for the picture of that, of KISS to be shown on the poster, because when you see the scale of it, like at the moment there are 27,000 children. Presently, because of lockdown, they're probably not at the school, but they're all in the same uniform, girls in pink and blue for boys. And one of the other features is girls and boys are not allowed to interact in the school, supposedly to stop any kind of sexual liaisons or anything, but it's completely, it means even brother and sister there cannot support each other, they cannot meet. It's also the denial of the tribal culture in terms of they have industrial kitchens there. So in these enormous vats, they make rice and dal and things every day. And every family tries to send some delicacies with their children to school. But as soon as every child reaches the gate of the school, and then they're in that school for 10 months of the year, then the bag is searched and any food from home is thrown in the bin in front of the child, and they're shown it's unhygienic. So in KISS, you see this model of, although the children are not forced to go there in the way that the police don't literally herd them from villages and take them there, but the economic pressures and the pressures from the administration and the police is very, very strong to send them there. Plus they're given all the services like free education is what KISS promises. Education, but from Santal students to speak in Santali or Gond students to speak in Gondi or anything like that. I think maybe I'll leave it there because I've already taken up 45 minutes from the beginning. So I'm sure you will lead me on to asking
you can take more time,
many other
Felix.
topics that I have reflected.
Felix, you can take more time. Hello? Felix, can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah, Felix, you can take more time, please.
Yes, I can hear you. Are you hearing me okay? Am I coming over
please,
coherently?
Yeah, please take more time. Yeah, feel free. Hello.
And then I would like lots of you to formulate questions because
questions, we have questions, many questions, but still you can continue for say 10 minutes.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to bring Charles Darwin in here because you mentioned that he was my ancestor, and maybe my way of looking at the world is quite colored by his way of seeing man as human beings as part of nature. So when Darwin's idea was applied to society by Marx and Engels, but also the World Bank, in a way, Darwin was looking at evolution among species, among thousands of species that are all interacting together. And he was never saying that all of species are trying to become like humans. Like the elephant shows its own path of evolution, the tiger a different path, the scorpion, the spider a different path. There's like lots and lots and lots and lots of different paths. And they may be sometimes competing, sometimes cooperating, but they're all going on their paths. So when the idea of evolution was applied to society by Herbert Spencer, who formed by the economists especially. I mean, I think Marx's scheme is about the best, that from primitive communism to feudalism, to slave-owning societies, to feudalism, to capitalism, and then, if we're lucky, back to an advanced socialism. But the trouble is, it's not as simple as that. It's in the name of imposing the uniformity of this monolithic path of development. That is what the World Bank uses when it calls some countries or regions, this is advanced country, this is developing country, and this is underdeveloped country. So these three categories, to see everything through that, then of course you look at tribal people and say, well, they're very underdeveloped. They need to be developed. And that goes into the idea of assimilation and education as a means to bring them forward, bring them into the mainstream and make them taxpayers and good citizens. So in KISS, you see how they are using this when they use terms like, they still use the term primitive, which should be in a way a term we all have to question, but they're also saying the aim of their education is to turn social liabilities into social assets, and tax receivers or benefit receivers to taxpayers. So in a way, they're also trying to create an industrial workforce there. And the other thing I suppose about KISS is it's an incredibly hierarchical educational setup and you see this, I don't know how many of you have watched any of the KISS videos, but when anybody comes, they start clapping, and then at a certain signal, they double the speed, and then at another signal, they and all in the same time. And this kind of regimentation, it's also obviously a regimentation of the mind. So maybe I will end by talking a little bit about what I see as the way forward. That in India, you do have these mostly quite small scale schools that are run on democratic principles, or run on the Paulo Freire principle, or some of them call themselves democratic schools, some of them, a lot of them use the tribal language. So I will tell you one event that happened last year. There was an Adivasi conclave in Bhopal, patronized by the Madhya Pradesh government, but they had many Adivasi leaders and intellectuals there. So I was invited as one non-tribal to go there, and a few other non-tribals were there. And it was very moving to be there. So then we broke up into groups to discuss education and many other different issues. So of course I went for education. And as I told you, one of the very progressive schools in India for Adivasis is in Bhopal itself, where this school Muskan works with Gond Adivasis who have been displaced over some generations and come to the city, and Pardi. And Pardi are a denotified tribe, what used to be called the criminal tribe. So although we often say that SC, ST, the Dalits and the Adivasis are the most exploited or oppressed people in India, actually the DNTs, the denotified tribes, are, the police still treat them as the British category of the criminal tribe. So they have their own language, and the Parthi used to be specialized hunters. They never did cultivation, so they never got land rights and settled down. And in fact, some of them have been employed by the tiger hunting mafia. They are very skilled hunters. But traditionally, they have this incredible knowledge of the forest and of all its inhabitants, or not just hunting, but also gathering and making rope, making baskets, and many things like that. So with the traditional occupation illegalized completely, they have become expert rubbish pickers and recyclers. So they live in the slums in Bhopal, basically, but they still have the language. So this Muskan, then it uses the language as a means for the children to regain a confidence in themselves and their culture, and so you have children teaching the teachers, and the teachers then, if a Gond child, teenager, 20-year-old, 24-year-old is teaching, then the Parthi is teaching them their language too. And of course, Hindi is very much used. So Hindi is often the main medium, but the tribal languages are hugely important. So what I witnessed, because the people in Bhopal had not invited the Muskan teachers, so I got them invited. So there were 10 young Adivasi teachers there. And when we were talking about education, there were also some Nagas there from the Northeast. So we were speaking in English, and some of the Adivasi leaders said, "Nahi, Hindi mein baatcheet karenge, hum sab Hindi samajhte hain ki nahi?" So it was all in Hindi. And then we were introducing ourselves, and these young Adivasi teachers, knowing Hindi very well, but they introduced themselves in Gondi or Parthi. And I actually felt I felt incredibly moved at that moment, because they were, in a way, in a gently humorous way, they were challenging the Adivasi elders to say, why do you have to use Hindi? क्यों हिंदी use करेंगे? क्यों अपना भाषा नहीं use करेंगे? And this is something, because every tribal language contains its own view of the world, you could say, and the loss of a language, so many of these languages are being lost. So you see from one generation to the other, nowadays often the Adivasi parents are encouraging their children to speak Hindi or English and not to speak their own language because they want them to get a job, obviously. But then the sadness, the grief of all the old values, that means the values of understanding nature, the values of equality, the values of playfulness between men and women, playfulness with the ancestors, and all that knowledge. So that's one aspect. And so in that meeting of the education group became very lively, that then can we make a more democratic kind of education where it's not just top down and a child isn't just coming there to be taught. Child is also going there to express themselves, and every child also knows a lot. And often they are in a place like KISS or the most boarding schools, they're just taught that is superstition, don't talk about that, don't do that, that's a dirty habit, that's backwards. Most Adivasis are internalizing this so ferociously over many years and many generations. So if you look at other countries, especially what happened in Canada or New Zealand after the residential schools were closed, you had the beginning of a different kind of education where, especially in New Zealand, the Maori are lucky because all Maori speak the same language. They may have been different tribes or clans, but the language is the same. So every New Zealander, every white New Zealander has to learn some Maori in school. And one of the things, for example, is part of the Maori culture is what's called, well, one thing is taboo. Taboo is an English word that comes from Maori, and it means sacred. So when Niangiri is, the mountaintop is considered sacred by the people, that is a taboo. And that is a taboo in the sense of the Maori, of considering nature that is not to be exploited or not to be damaged at all. And the other concept they have is what they call a mihi, where every child learns to say, even a white child learns to say in the Maori language, I come from this river, this is my mountain, and these are my ancestors. And then they compose a piece to define their identity in relation to nature in that way. So, there's many, many other aspects of this, of who is indigenous, was the starting question. Then what is real education? Is it passing exams so that you can get jobs and go into the labor market? Or is it really to think critically and ask questions? So questions, please.
Thank you so much for this fascinating lecture, Felix Padel. Thanks again. And with your rigorous training in anthropology and the beautiful insights of anthropological insights and sociological insights, we are reminded of Delhi School of Economics once again. Today, sitting with you gives me immense pleasure and that comfort that we have in the research colloquium of Delhi School of Economics. You also being the student of Delhi School of Economics, and many of us being the student of the Delhi School of Economics, have that promise, have that training to lead democratic values. In this context of not taking much time, we have Professor Jagmohan Singh. He is the nephew of Shahid Bhagat Singh, the Indian martyr Shahid Bhagat Singh.
It's so wonderful to be here.
Yeah, I'll invite Professor Jagmohan Singh, sir, to share his views. Professor Jagmohan Singh, sir.
Dr. Flex, I'm actually fascinated with your work and your insight into our that original life, and you rightly said that actually Adivasi is a protector of the nature, and all our new forces are destructive of the nature. So there is a contradiction between that, and that is very important. How do we progress with all that? They have the knowledge pool of the forest, and that knowledge is being lost. Along with that, I visited many places that they have much better knowledge of their local crops, and they have lived, and without destruction, as you rightly said, they actually nurture the nature, the water resources, and all that. But that's just one of the, and it was really fascinating to listen to your so rigorous analysis. So I thank you very much on my behalf, and we will continue. I will, so there is much to understand, and maybe we have some other sessions with you to understand the problem. And you are very rightly said that the modern approach is to isolate them from their own environment and put them into an artificial environment, depress them instead of encouraging them and utilizing their resources for build up of the nation. I think that way, I'm thankful to you. Maybe there are more questions. We would like to have others chance to react to that. Back to Mrityunjay.
Yes, thank you for that. From their environment, by putting them into the residential school, it's like a museumization in a different way, actually.
Can I ask a small question?
Please. Yeah.
This is Tribhunath Dubey from Kota, Rajasthan. And it was a wonderful opportunity to hear you, Felix. It was such a great exposition, and where we explained in detail. It was really enlightening for all of us. My one submission is that one of my friend who was working with some tribal communities in Maharashtra, he faced a situation, and that somehow, I want to just pose that question before you, because we have worked so extensively on this issue. Like when he was trying to, work for these tribal communities, he was trying to set up a school, and he wanted to develop curriculum and pedagogy medium in their local language. And those people very clearly, the parents of the communities there, they very clearly said that no, we want English education for our children. So in your experience, because they were aware that how language is a power and how English as a language is a power, source of power in India. So they demanded English education for your children. So as you rightly said that education should be democratic, education should be through their cultures and in their language. Very rightly said. But how did you ever encountered a situation where communities demanding education in a language of power? And if that is so,
yes,
how do we deal with it?
Yes, it's actually a very common situation. And I've heard this also from Muskan and other places, that initially, very often the parents themselves are saying, Hamara Basha ko gaya, aajkal Hindi ya English seekhna padega. I mean, because there is so much economic pressure, A, and B, the parents themselves, they have been, if you imagine those Adivasi parents, if they went to school, even up to standard 3 or 4, all the time they were at school, they were told, Apka pichle Adivasi Basha mat batao. It's like they have internalized this contempt, if you like, for their own culture and language. And this is one of the big problems, really. And I think the way around it, what Muskan does is, if you develop a democratic atmosphere where teachers actually see themselves on the same level as children, not as superior or anything, and then ask the children, what do you want to learn? Okay, you want to learn English. Okay, we'll have English class. Okay, you want to do mainly Hindi, that's fine. Okay, you want to speak your own language, and then you begin to play with it and play with language and saying, hey, why do you say this in your language? Because very often, like in Bihar also with, I don't know, Bhojpuri and Maithili, these languages are considered, they're the language that's spoken often at home, and yet they are not brought into the classroom. So with this Paulo Freire kind of education, children are actually asked, so what is the reality? What is happening in your home, in your daily life? And the child might say, well, the police came to my house and they took my brother to jail recently, and my father got drunk and he beat up my mother. And, you know, they'd say very, very hard truths. But if you start from these hard truths, then you begin to get an education that is more real. And then the actual education of learning the things that motivate you, where you might get a job, then they become real. Where you report them, you're always competing for higher status than the other classmates. I mean, that's just of course, this is a very complex question. I hope that goes some way to answer. Anybody else?
Thank you so much.
So please do ask a question, anybody. Mrityunjay, you can start if you like, or anybody else can.
Hello.
Please ask.
Yeah, Felix, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, yeah.
Yeah, we have a question from Professor Ziauddin. He teaches sociology. His question is, how do we see the gradual decline in celebration by tribes in Jharkhand? Likewise, Karma was much celebrated a few years at larger scale, but these are getting merged with other Hindu festivals. How do we see such instances? Thank you.
Okay, well, yeah, this is quite a painful question, and it comes on to the whole question of Hindutva, really, because maybe what I didn't say and didn't spell out enough is, along with the ashram schools and along with the schooling, it's not only spreading an ideology of industrialization, it's spreading an ideology of Hindutva. And that's why, you know, in Gujarat and in Kandahar, Orissa, unfortunately, you had Adivasis who are like the footholders, made into the foot soldiers of Hindutva. So they have actualized, in a sense, the Gurier's idea of tribal people as backward Hindus. And then they're learning to be proper Hindus and to say prayers in Sanskrit. So in KISS, you have all these Sanskrit prayers. In Master, run by one of the those missionary societies, and they have Sanskrit classes at 5 in the morning. I mean, Sanskrit is a great language, but you know, Gondi is just as old a language. It comes from an oral tradition. So I mean, like originally Sanskrit, the Vedas were not originally written down, but the oral tradition means it's a really living tradition, and they're not allowed to speak Gondi in school. They certainly don't have a Gondi class any time of the day. So this Sanskritization or Hinduization or Hindutvaization, as you all know, I mean, the RSS has, I think I've seen the figure 7,000 schools if you count the Sarasvati and all the others. So I'm afraid, you know, they're taught that actually to be civilized means to be Hindu and going properly to the temple, and like with the I've known Adivasis who say join the police, and then to be a police, I mean, you can't go and consult a shaman or anything. You would lose status. Everybody would laugh at you. You would probably lose your job, to the temple like everybody else, become a good Hindu. I'm afraid, you know, it's towards it, get inside all the other Hindu pujas, which is fine, but then Christians are not allowed to celebrate Christmas. And above all, the local Adivasi deities and festivals have no place. So this is a situation you all know, and it's not easy to talk about, but I hope that begins to answer that question.
Yeah, Felix, next question we have from Jairam Paswan. He teaches Hindi in West Bengal. His question is, and I quote, "Sir, as you have said that Adivasi are most democratic people on earth, then why so-called mainstream people not really willing to adopt their democratic culture, democratic setup of the society? Kindly share your views on this point. Thank you."
Thank you so much for that question. I saw it in the chat box. Yeah, it's a really good question, because if you go back to what I talked about, the missionary schools, and the aim of the missionary schools was to create a tribal elite. Hogia, I mean, they did that. Obviously, whatever elements of class were already there in tribal society, and they do have some elements of class even before the British, but the British massively, massively increased that class element because they wanted an elite to rule through. And I'm afraid all of you know, whether it's in the Northeast or in Jharkhand or other places, some of the tribal politicians are notoriously corrupt. And this is a very, very difficult thing for non-tribal people to talk about. And obviously it goes completely against that democratic tradition. But if you really talk to a lot of the Adivasis, they say, well, actually a lot of the main exploiters are people now from our own community. So you could say the reason why these democratic traditions among Adivasis have been so badly damaged is because nobody listened to Jayapal Singh Munda, either then at independence or in the Jharkhand movement or in formulating the scheduled tribe as the category rather than Adivasi. And I'm afraid, although I have huge respect for Ambedkar was part of that formulation of scheduled tribe and rejection of the term Adivasi. So the reasons for Adivasis, this massive decline in the democratic tradition, if you go to a village and you see how they speak about any issue, then yes, you see democracy at work. But in terms of even the politics, even the Gram Sabha, the political parties, they're all playing their game. Corruption is very much there. Many, many forces are combining, and above all, of course, the corporates and everything the corporates are doing to undermine that. Okay, more question, please.
Yeah, Felix, we have question from Professor Ziauddin once again. He says, and I quote, "Adivasis are considered most underprivileged and least benefited from the modern development. While there is a sharp erosion in the traditional skills and know-how transferred to them generationally, it's true, but how do you relook the loss of such rich knowledge and associated languages to each tribes?" Your comment space. Thank you. Felix, should I repeat the question? Felix? Felix? Felix?
उनकी बैंडविड्थ से थोड़ी प्रॉब्लम थी मेरे को.
Yeah. Please bear with us. Felix will be back very soon.
No, he is back. He is back.
He is back. वो mute किया हुआ है.
Okay, once.
हाँ, बुला गया वो.
Felix, Yeah, Felix, can you hear? Hello? Felix, can
Yeah.
you hear us?
I can hear you now.
Yes.
For some
Yeah.
reason it cut off.
Yeah, the question is from Professor Ziauddin. Once again.
Yes.
And yeah, Adivasis are considered most underprivileged and least benefited from the modern development. While there is a sharp erosion in the traditional skills and know-how transferred to them generationally, it's true, but how do you relook the loss of such rich knowledge and associated languages to each tribes? Your comments.
Okay. Unfortunately, finding it very hard to hear, but I think I got your question more or less. Why is the Adivasi knowledge being eroded? Well, obviously, I've talked about that a lot, how the school system has eroded that knowledge, those skills. And in terms of the underprivileged, absolutely. So I think really it's just an extension of what I've been saying before that I would like to say, that we look on development as a unilinear process. In terms of the real multilingualism or multiculturalism, you know, our political formations, especially in India right now, there's such marginalization. It's very, very hard for even the basic rights to be asserted, really. So it's an incredibly important question, but terribly hard to answer right now. And I'm finding it hard to hear, unfortunately. Is there another question? Did I?
Yeah, Felix, you are very much audible. Yeah, the next question is, Felix, thanks for the wonderful lecture. Can you please elaborate more on the corporate to industrial nexus and Adivasi education being promoted today? What effects does this sort of nexus have on the future of rich Adivasi knowledge, which is much needed now to democratize knowledge itself? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I mean, the question itself shows your understanding, you know, what is happening. So if you look at Tata Steel, I'm sure a lot of you know about that, and it's had a lot of tribal education schemes in Jharkhand, in Orissa. So if you see what really happens in those schemes, it is really corporatizing the minds, you could say. And I have actually sat opposite the head of Tata Steel talking about this issue once when he was challenged about, in Kalinganagar, surely all the resistance is not just coming from Maoists, it's actually, people really don't want your model of development there. And he said, we understand the tribal people so well. And, you know, no anthropologist like me or anybody would say, I understand the tribal people. It's for them to understand themselves. So when you see a corporation saying, we understand them, we know how to, they're almost saying like, we know how to impose our power over them. We know how to enslave them. So, I mean, yeah, as I said, your question just shows you have this basic understanding of what is happening. That the corporations are not just grabbing the land of the Adivasis, they're grabbing the minds of the Adivasis and dividing. If you see any Andolan, any movement that is opposing the takeover of local land, the first thing the corporate does, often with the police and sometimes local politicians and people too, divide the people into those who you can deal with, who are often the elite, and those who don't have land rights, who you can just colonize, and at best you can make them come into your schools or become a wage laborer for you. Sorry, that's pretty harsh, but I think you all know that it's the reality. Anything else?
We have Nazreen Fatima, BA Honors Final Year student. She wants to ask something. Nazreen, please.
Thank you, sir, for such an enlightening session.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, I'd like to ask one question. Like, there was a point where you talked about the difference between two situations where the children, when they see their parents working in a field or in some other occupation,
Yes.
so they naturally want to take part in those things, and another situation where they are exploited in factories or other hazardous jobs. So as much as I have studied till now about child labor, so I feel that even in sociology, like in the discourse, there is sort of lack of understanding of this, this minor aspect, because it is the natural tendency to generally just equate child labor with illiteracy of the parents, unwillingness of them to send their children to school. So do you feel that your insight should be a part of the mainstream? Because I feel this is very important.
Again, thank you so much for that question. It really puts the spotlight on this thing of what is real learning. And when learning comes from a child, when you respect the child's own impulse towards learning versus learning that is top down. Because when you see children going into, tribal children especially, going into a school, the first thing they have to learn is Karaho, better. And then, you impose that discipline in a rigid way from the start. And this is something they're never told in their own culture. So the first thing that is learnt in most mainstream schools, for non-tribals also, is discipline. And then horrible punishments, humiliation for the people who are stepping out of line or who are questioning the teacher and getting the class to laugh at another student who is seen as to be as backward or something like that. So fantastic question, and continue in this work and questioning and thinking. Thank you.
Thank you.
There is someone called Anthony. He wants to ask question. Anthony, please. Anthony, are you there?
Anthony?
Okay.
You have to
Ankit
unmute
Pandey,
yourself, by the way. Yeah.
Ankit Pandey, please. Ankit
Okay,
Pandey
yes.
has a question.
Yeah.
He was a student of Mahatma Gandhi Central University of Social Work. Now he is in Lucknow. Ankit, please.
Unmute yourself, by the way, to ask your question.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Hello, Ankit. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. Actually,
Hello.
my question is for the young aspirants. Actually, the young people, young students from these the tribal community. They have in my opinion, they have this problem when we see them in the market, in the education sector, that they move from primary education to secondary and senior secondary. The gross enrollment ratio will decline. If we see that there's a decline in the gross enrollment ratio. Now the problem is that when we ask question from these people, I asked these questions from some of my friends belong to these communities, and they told me that the problem is that they have to make a balance between their physiological their basic need. Unless their basic need were justified, they will not be able to continue their education. Now this is the big problem. This is a complete cycle. If they won't complete their education, they won't be able to go to the job market and enhance their economic conditions. And now there is an act called the Forest Dwellers Act, 2006, if I am right. This act particularly deals with the forest produce which they sell as to gain some economic benefits. So this particular act is not sufficient to provide them such economic conditions so that they can fulfill their the education for their children and their family needs, day-to-day basic needs. So I want your opinion on that. How can they justify? How can they make balance between these two? Where we as a society fail to to help them to overcome from this crisis. Thank you. Sir. Hello.
Okay.
Hello.
Schools, and also the shrinking space where
Yes.
the government is seeing as its duty to pay for the education pay. So, you know, strong government should really set its role in that aspect.
फ्लेक्स अगर आप अपनी वीडियो बंद कर लें तो इम्प्रूव करेगा वो भी ऑफ ही होगा
Felix, can you hear us? Felix.
उनका माइक ऑफ है बैंडविड्थ प्रॉब्लम थी उनकी
We are really sorry for that. Please have patience.
Hello, yes. Can you hear me again now? Sorry.
Yeah, Felix.
So any more questions? I think it's getting, the connection is not that good. I'm so sorry. Now you're muted, Mrityunjay.
Sorry. Felix, there is one question from Sanjay Kumar. He is assistant professor in Department of Sociology, Mahatma Gandhi Central University. He is asking, and I quote, what should be the viable strategy to protect tribal rights? Thank you.
Wow, well, I mean, that is such a broad question. And obviously, we have the Forest Rights Act, we have the PESA Act, we have many other constitutional rights, and the trouble is they're just not being implemented properly often. And maybe the thing that I could leave you with that most strongly would be like, if you see the place of indigenous people in Canada or New Zealand or other places, they are beginning to assert themselves. Even in Ecuador, in Latin America, the tribal movements are incredibly strong. And need to decolonize their own minds. It can't be done by us non-tribals, really. They have to insist for education that is under their own control, that nobody is going to teach them what they should learn. And actually, we're a long, long, long way from that situation because, and this has been said by certain Adivasi friends to me, including Abhay Kaka, who some of you may know of, who was a brilliant JNU educated Adivasi friend who died in North Bengal a few months ago, and many others who say it's like Adivasis have been almost taught to be slaves, really, and to despise their own culture and their own families and their own traditions. And so many ways they have their own faith in their land rights has been eroded. But if those of us who believe in democratic values and who we can be seen to, respect to and listen to Adivasi voices more, then the situation can change. It's a very, very hard struggle, obviously. not easy. There's no easy answer to these things.
Felix, there is one question that is on WhatsApp, on personal number. It has been asked. Corona crisis is also because of the environmental crisis. How to save environment, how to go back once again, and to what extent we can go back to our tribe, to our Adivasi culture. Thank you. Felix? Felix?
Say unmute kariye, Felix.
Sorry, yeah. So yes, with the lockdown at the moment, I guess most universities and schools are not functioning in the normal way. And like we're doing this by Zoom, and a lot of your classes probably you're doing at distance through computers. And obviously, if you look at the situation of tribal people and tribal schools, they don't have a computer in every home. So they might be doing it by mobile sometimes, but it's much harder for them. And I have in all the states actually, for in a way, the situation of the lockdown, which personally I think has been done in India worse than any other country in the world because of the so the it does give a chance at the moment while we're locked down for local initiatives to happen. I mean, there's a lot more to say about the pandemic and the lockdown situation, but I can see some ways where it can be turned positively, even though for most of us, for most people, it is really a very, very, very harsh situation.
Felix, there is one question related to education. The question is like, and I quote, "Education should be for liberation, not for enslavement. But the present national education policy, the draft one, is to make us enslaved, and particularly the Adivasis and the other marginalized. So what you suggest?"
I think simply what I have been saying already, that we need education for emancipation and for critical thinking, rather than education where we have to pass exams all the time and are just trying to learn by rote, receive knowledge that then we become a kind of status symbol, and where educated people think that they are better than so-called uneducated people.
One more question on your discipline, our discipline, that is about the role of anthropology and sociology. Felix, that is on the role of sociology and anthropology. The question goes like, what should be the role of, or what is the role of anthropology and sociology in developing the critical faculty?
Thank you very much for this. I'm just plugging in my computer because it's about to die. The difference, this was my starting point of the whole talk, of the difference between anthropology and sociology in India from in other countries, where in some ways anthropology in Western countries is seen as the most emancipatory subject. You learn what is the role of human society in different kinds of culture, and you learn the differences between cultures. But in India, because you still have governments, people who are studying the government anthropologists who are specialists in the tribal people, it becomes a totally top-down kind of knowledge. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to plug my computer in. I'm charging the mobile, but where has that gone? Yes, it's in the wall there. Is it? Sorry. This is the one. Sorry, I should have done that before. So that's very easy to plug into that.
Yes, but this is mine. This is yours.
I'm so sorry about that. Yeah, my computer's about to die because the battery's low. So I find this, I mean, actually within the last few days, I don't know whether any of you have followed this, but the World Anthropology Congress was due to be held in KISS in 2023. And then a petition started to make it not happen in KISS, because it was understood that KISS is a very anti-democratic institution. So the World Anthropology Congress decided not to hold it in KISS. And now India's anthropologists have almost united in saying it has to happen in KISS. KISS is offering us the free facilities, and there's nothing wrong with KISS. So it's a very, very interesting moment in anthropology and sociology in India, actually, because you have, in a way, what is a democratic decision? You can say maybe the World Anthropology Congress made an anti-democratic decision in unilaterally cancelling the arrangement to do it in KISS, but then how was that decision arrived at in the first place? What was the lobbying by KISS? And what is the people? Because in Bhubaneswar, you have what's called the Orissa Tribal Museum, and that has a very close relationship with KISS. So all the foreign ambassadors who are taken to KISS, they're also taken to the Tribal Museum. In a way, I would say falsely, you have all of tribal culture museumized there. You have all the ornaments and all the traditional clothes, musical instruments, bows and arrows, everything that is not allowed in KISS. So the children there are not allowed to wear any ornament. So you have the anthropological, what this is saying is you have the anthropological objectification. And I've seen this in Ranchi as well as other tribal museums in India. You see life-size models of the tribal people, really making them look terribly primitive. And it's really racist, actually. It's really dehumanizing. It's what you could call cultural racism. So anthropologists still will often measure a tribal person's head or their there's a New Zealand Maori academic woman called Linda Tohiwai Smith, and she's written a book called Decolonizing Methodologies, Research and Indigenous People, where she really talks about how to decolonize the whole thing of research involving Indigenous people, where you begin to make the people into subjects rather than the objects of study. So I think this is something that is really, really badly needed in anthropology. And I think a lot of Indian sociologists, in India, sociology is the subject that is often very emancipatory, that you are learning to question what is happening in society, where inequality is coming from. Well, and if you look at this conceptually, like the methodology, what is an anthropologist studying in India? You study a village, but if you're not studying the power structure with the police, if you're not studying the government, what they believe, what they're doing, if you're not studying the corporations, or just studying the tribal people, it's a hierarchy of knowledge. We need to reverse the hierarchy. And that's why, you know, in my second book, Out of This Earth, I studied the aluminium corporations and the mining companies, because they really do need to be studied. I remember when I was first doing sociology 40 years ago in the Delhi School of Economics, there was a student who wanted to do his PhD studying the Indian police service, and he wasn't allowed to. But, you know, the police, they need to be studied. They need, not as an act of revenge or anything, but really to understand how they operate. I mean, within other countries, even Britain to some extent, you have some neutral commissions that are studying, is there racism in the police? Where is recruitment coming from, and so on. So reverse the lens of anthropological analysis, and then anthropology becomes the most wonderful subject. But if it retains this colonial kind of hierarchy, it can be quite an anti-democratic subject.
Thank you, Felix. Last question we are supposed to take, because already we are late and you are tired. Shubh,
great, actually.
yeah. Shubh, can you please ask your question, Shubh? Please unmute yourself.
Is that Shubh Mathur?
Yes, it is. And thank you so much to the speakers and organizers and participants. It's been a wonderful event. And I'm not a specialist in tribal culture, but so I'm sorry to jump in, but I think what was really striking was that, you know, the ideas of democracy and connecting to the environment that are tribal values, you know, it's not just tribal people who need to be aware of those, but non-tribals as well, you know.
Absolutely.
It was said that, you know, democracy is, you know, they're the most democratic people, and India at this point is very lacking in democracy. And, you know, as somebody who studied various minorities, and, you know, it's the ideas of social justice and democracy and connecting to the environment. These values are so important. And I guess the question is really, how do we, you know, start up a discussion that brings them to what's called the mainstream, and use these to transform the mainstream, which is very unjust and unequal. What are the kinds of forums, in some ways, the, you know, the nuts and bolts of it almost, you know, what are the kind of practical steps we can take to change the, in fact, like you said, you know, turn the lens around, turn the dialogue around. So it's, you know, what's called the mainstream listening to tribal societies and to other minorities for their ideas of social justice and equality. Thank you.
Thank you, Shubh. Yeah, I mean, how do we do this? As you said, it's not concerning tribal people at all, but in terms of how do we begin to learn from the marginalized rather than continue to oppress and marginalize them? And a country like New Zealand has a relative luxury that they've actually managed to do it, but they have much smaller population in relation to the landscape and so on. And even there, things are far from perfect. So I think the only thing I can do is really leave us all with those questions of how do we turn the lens? How do we begin to learn from those children, with those children, rather than seeing those children as backward little things that just have to learn to be civilized, to put it crudely. But, you know, we live in pretty crude times, and that's often how what's actually happening. So, Mrityunjay, all of you there, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Felix, for
questioning
this.
has to continue.
Yeah. And now, one more question is there. If you permit, should I read the question?
Sure.
Okay. This is from one assistant professor from West Bengal. The question is, sir, those Adivasis who are migrated from their land, on one hand, they are really gaining the better lifestyle, but in another, they are really losing their identification. This is the major challenge in front of Adivasis identity. Kindly share your view on it.
Again, thank you very much for that, because as I'm sure all of you know far better than me, I mean, the lockdown in India has affected literally millions of migrant labourers so badly, and a large proportion of them are Adivasis. And the reasons why they have left their land are many. Number one, the dispossession of the land that has happened both by corporations and in many, many, many other ways, not just recently, but for a long time, but more and more harshly recently. So that disposition is one reason. Another reason is what some of the other questions pointed to, that the whole market is oriented against Adivasis. So it's terribly hard for them to make a living in the traditional way. And I mean, when I first went to an Adivasi village in Bastar, this was in 1982, and I remember a friend there, an Adivasi giving his friend his money to count, because he didn't know how to count the notes. Literally, what did they use money for? They used it for bribing police or forest officials when they came. They used it a bit in the market, but in the market it would be more often in terms of exchange. And then more and more they use it for education. So even if the education is supposed to be free in the government school, in practice they have to pay for whatever. And increasingly Adivasis think they have to invest. I suppose we have a change from where an Adivasi village, like I remember it, like it used to be, saw itself as the center of the world. And they knew there were other bigger centers, but they didn't really want to have that much to do with them. And now more and more it's been instilled into them that they're backward, and more with the decline in what they can get through the markets and everything, and dependence, even dependence on rations, like the rations that they get, the quality of the dal and rice is much, much inferior to what they grow. Often traditionally they grew millet, but partly for status reasons and economic reasons, they are growing more rice, where it's less nutritious, growing less vegetables. The climate is also changing, but I think, like, you know, the farmer suicides, that's maybe more among non-tribal farmers, but it's a symptom of the incredible extent to which the economy and the market has been systematically oriented against the interests of the small-scale farming. So migration, it's with us all. You know, here in the West, you know that the issue of immigrants and what a potent political issue that is in Britain, in France, in America. But why are people fleeing from those countries? Because there's war there, because there's, again, the economic pressures on those poorer countries has been absolutely inexorable. So very often I try to say to people in Britain, don't you understand that, like, these people, Britain has supported wars in those countries like Syria and Iraq. And now you see the consequences where people, they can no longer make a living there. So it's not completely different from the situation happening in India, where obviously you have the Maoist situation that has also displaced tens of thousands of Adivasis. So again, keep asking the questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Felix. We need to question the unquestioned. We need to doubt everything, including ourselves. With this promise, before I move to Professor Pramod Meena, who is President of Mahatma Gandhi Central University Teachers Association, I have one request and one information to share. The request, I will start with the request. Friends, we are facing a very repressive order. National Education Policy 2022, though is quite contradictory, full of contradictions, bundle of contradictions. Though Indian government claims that we should go for Atmanirbharta, self-dependence, but on the other hand, this government is hell-bent on selling everything, corporatizing everything, and education is not a spare too. So this new education policy is to make us once again slaves. It is a kind of surrender before World Bank. So we need to resist this imperialist policy. before it gets implemented, we have to get united and need to register so that the better world, the world that we had among Adivasis, that kind of world we should be able to have, a democratic world, a world full of questions, full of clarities, full of democratic values, full of life, full of hope, not the world which is governed by the corporates and is of the corporates and for the corporates, a world that is inclusive and not discriminatory. So with this appeal, I also share one information. Last lecture, as you know, Mahatma Gandhi Central University Teachers Association is organizing online lecture series. On every weekend we have one talk, online talk. So we had Padma Shri Sudha Varghese. So many questions were unanswered. She is kind enough to address once again today at 7:30. She will join us at 7:30. So if you have time, if you are willing, you can join us at our Facebook page. And the talk's title is marginalized women and their rights, and of course their struggles. So with this word, I request Professor Pramod Meena, to take over.
Thank you, Mrityunjay. Thank you very much.
I want to speak in Hindi. I think Professor Felix also can understand.
Sure.
सबसे पहले मैं महात्मा गांधी केंद्रीय विश्वविद्यालय के शिक्षक संघ की तरफ में लिया. From around 2 hours we were discussing on this topic आदिवासी, पर्यावरण और शिक्षा. ये जो विषय है निश्चित रूप से बहुत मुझे लगता है काफी प्रासंगिक विषय है, क्योंकि न्यू एजुकेशन पॉलिसी अभी उसकी चर्चा चल रही है. पॉलिसी नहीं बनी है, वो एक मसौदा है, ड्राफ्ट है, न्यू एजुकेशन ड्राफ्ट, पॉलिसी का ड्राफ्ट. तो उसमें आदिवासियों का जो पहलू है जिसकी उपेक्षा हो रही थी, उसके ऊपर कई सारी बातें जो प्रोफेसर फिलिप्स ने रखी, और उन्होंने पूरे एक हिस्टोरिकल पर्सपेक्टिव में अपनी बातें रखी कि किस तरह से आदिवासियों के अंदर एक औपचारिक शिक्षा की शुरुआत होती है. ईसाई मिशनरी जो है वहां से उन्होंने शुरू करते हुए वर्तमान में जो आश्रम स्कूल जो आदिवासी इलाकों में खोले गए हैं, और ये बताने का प्रयास किया कि इन दोनों में कोई डिफरेंस है नहीं. डीकोलोनाइजेशन की बात चाहे इस समय सरकार कर रही हो, लेकिन इनका पूरा जो कंसेप्ट है, आश्रम स्कूल का कंसेप्ट और ईसाई चर्च के जो स्कूल हुआ करते थे, दोनों का कंसेप्ट लगभग एक जैसा ही कंसेप्ट है. कोलोनाइजेशन की ही एक प्रवृत्ति वहां पर है, और आदिवासियों को वहां पर वस्तु के रूप में देखा गया है, ऑब्जेक्ट के रूप में उनके साथ ट्रीट किया जाता है. आपने जो है भाषा के सवाल पर काफी सारी महत्वपूर्ण बातें रखी कि भाषा का सवाल बहुत महत्वपूर्ण सवाल है आदिवासियों के संदर्भ में, क्योंकि भाषा उनकी सिर्फ माध्यम नहीं है शिक्षा का, वो अपने आप में एक पूरी आदिवासी कल्चर जो है उसको रिप्रेजेंट करती है. उनके जो वैल्यूज है आदिवासियों के, ट्राइबल्स के, उन वैल्यूज के साथ सीधा भाषा का संबंध है. और ठक्कर बापा के साथ जो जयपाल सिंह मुंडा की जो पूरी बहस है, जिसमें असल में ठक्कर बापा जो है वो गांधीवादी जो दृष्टिकोण है कुछ आदिवासियों के संदर्भ में, उसको रिप्रेजेंट भी वहां पर कर रहे होते हैं. और साथ ही नेहरू का क्या दृष्टिकोण आदिवासियों के संदर्भ में था, तो उस पहलू को भी आपने सामने रखा. और इनसे इतर जो है जयपाल सिंह मुंडा का दृष्टिकोण है, ये दूसरे आदिवासियों का अपना दृष्टिकोण रहा है. और अंबेडकर के साथ भी उनके कुछ जो मतभेद रहे, वहां पर चीजों को समझा जा सकता है. वर्तमान जो पूरी शिक्षा व्यवस्था है वो किस तरह आदिवासियों की स्वाभाविकता को नष्ट करती है और एक डिसिप्लिन उनके अंदर डालना चाहती है, जो सहजता है आदिवासी जीवन की, उसको किस तरह से शिक्षा के माध्यम से नष्ट किया जा रहा है. और आदिवासियों उनका इस्तेमाल राष्ट्र राज्य के नेशन स्टेट के द्वारा किया जा रहा है अपने आर्थिक स्वार्थों की पूर्ति के लिए, न कि आदिवासियों के प्रति उस तरह की प्रतिबद्धता है, उनकी स्वायत्ता का जो सम्मान होना चाहिए जो नहीं हो पा रहा है। तो ये तमाम चीजें हैं जो आपके पूरे वक्तव्य में देखी जा सकती है। और उन सबका भी धन्यवाद जिन्होंने प्रोफेसर फिलिक्स से अपने सवाल किए। हालांकि समय के अभाव के कारण उन तमाम सवालों को हम नहीं ले सकते थे, लेकिन फिर भी हमने कोशिश की। और प्रोफेसर जगमोहन जी का भी आभार कि वो हमारे साथ पुनः जुड़े, उनका व्याख्यान भी हमने आयोजित किया था। और दर्शकों में मैं कुछ लोगों को देख रहा हूँ, उसमें महादेव टोपो जी है जो खुद एक बड़े आदिवासी कवि के रूप में है झारखंड से। तो आप सबका आभार, और हम प्रयास करेंगे कि आगे भी इसी तरह के समसामयिक विषय के ऊपर निरंतर ये जो संवाद की प्रक्रिया है इसको जारी रखा जाए। तो आप सबका पुनः आभार, धन्यवाद।
Thank you, Pramod sir, for being so brief and so brief but very insightful summary that you have presented. Friends, on behalf of Mahatma Gandhi Central University Teachers Association, East Champaran, Bihar, India, we once again thank you. We promise that we will meet very, very soon with some other lecture. But today also we have Sudha Varkis with us on the topic of marginalized women and their rights, and of course their struggles, their resistance. So if you have time, please join us at 7:30. Colleagues and students, thank you very much.